Sarah Chen had spent 6 years translating silence into strategy. Her office on Defense Station Kepler 7 occupied a corner module where 2 observation walls met, offering a panoramic view of Mars's rust-colored curve and the black expanse beyond. She kept the lights low, preferring the ambient glow of her translation matrices to overhead illumination. The screens displayed linguistic patterns from 43 known species, color-coded by threat assessment, constantly updating as new communications traffic filtered through the monitoring arrays. She pressed 2 fingers against her left temple, a habit formed during her doctoral work at Cambridge, when decoding the syntactic structures of the Velkari trade language had given her migraines that lasted for days. The gesture no longer relieved pressure. It simply marked the transition between one analytical task and the next, a physical punctuation her body required. Her coffee had gone cold in its magnetic cup. She didn't remember making it. The chronometer indicated she'd been working for 11 hours straight, but the station operated on a 26-hour cycle that never quite aligned with her circadian rhythms. Sleep happened in fragments, stolen between transmission analyses and protocol reviews. The door chimed. Sarah didn't turn from her screens. "Come in." Admiral Marcus Torres entered with the particular economy of movement that military training produced. No wasted energy, no unnecessary sound. She recognized him by his reflection in the dark viewport, the way his shoulders filled the doorframe, the slight hesitation before he crossed the threshold into her workspace. They'd served together for 18 months, and she'd learned to read the microscopic tells that preceded his decisions. Dr. Chen. His voice carried the roughness of too many briefings, too many command decisions compressed into inadequate time. "We need you in tactical." Sarah saved her work without looking at him directly. "New contact?" "Unknown configuration. 78 ships holding position beyond Mars orbit." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of recycled air and fatigue that clung to everyone who'd spent too long in the station's environmental systems. "They transmitted a demand protocol 20 minutes ago." She finally turned, meeting his eyes. Dark, intelligent, with the particular weariness that came from holding other people's lives in the balance. "Which structure?" "That's what we need you to determine." Torres handed her a data tablet, his fingers brushing hers in the transfer, brief contact that registered as warmth against her perpetually cold hands. "It doesn't match any known framework." Sarah scanned the linguistic markers, her mind automatically parsing the syntactic patterns, the semantic weight distribution, the cultural assumptions embedded in word choice and grammatical structure. Her pulse remained steady, a point of pride. 6 years of training herself not to react until she understood the complete picture. "They call themselves the Harvest Fleet," she said quietly. "This is a resource extraction demand. They're offering trade terms, but the grammatical construction assumes compliance as default." Torres moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could sense the heat radiating from his body in the cool office. He studied the translation over her shoulder, his presence creating a pocket of warmth that her body leaned into fractionally before she caught herself and straightened. "Can you draft a response?" he asked. "I can draft 50 responses." Sarah set the tablet down, her fingers already composing diplomatic frameworks in her mind, the careful dance of acknowledgement without capitulation, the strategic ambiguity that bought time for military preparation. "The question is what you want to say." Torres was silent for a long moment. She felt, rather than saw, the shift in his breathing, the particular stillness that came over him when he was about to make an irreversible choice. "What would you say?" he finally asked. "If it was your decision." Sarah looked up at him, found his gaze already on her, and something passed between them that had no name in any of the 43 languages she'd mastered. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that they were both people who'd built careers on maintaining distance, on never letting anyone close enough to see the choices that kept them awake at night. "I'd tell them to leave," she said quietly, "and I'd mean it." His hand rose as if to touch her shoulder, then stopped midway, hovering in the space between intention and action. "Draft it," he said, his voice rough. 7 words or less. She turned back to her screens, feeling the absence of his touch like a drop in temperature. Her fingers moved across the interface, selecting words with the precision of a surgeon choosing which tissue to cut. When she finished, the message glowed in the center of her primary display. "Leave now, or we will make you." Torres read it twice, his reflection superimposed over the text in the dark screen. No negotiation protocols? Negotiation assumes we're asking. This isn't a question. He nodded slowly, and she watched his hand fall back to his side, the decision made. Send it. Sarah executed the command with a single keystroke. The message transmitted through the deep space array, racing toward the harvest fleet at light speed. 7 words to define whether humanity remained sovereign or became another resource point in someone else's supply chain. Torres didn't move to leave. They stood together in the dim office, watching the alien formation hold its position beyond Mars' orbit. 2 people who'd built their lives on words and now waited to see if silence would follow. The tactical center occupied the station's core, a spherical chamber where holographic displays created a 3-dimensional map of human-controlled space. Sarah had spent the last 70 hours there, surviving on coffee and brief periods of unconsciousness, stolen while sitting in her analysis station. The chair's ergonomic design had been optimized for 12-hour shifts, not 3-day marathons, and her spine ached with a dull persistence that she'd learned to ignore. The harvest fleet maintained its position with geometric precision. 78 ships in a formation that spoke of centuries of experience, of protocols tested across dozens of species. They hadn't responded to humanity's 7-word transmission. They also hadn't retreated. Sarah monitored their communication channels, listening to the alien conversations with the focused intensity that had made her the Defense Corps' senior xenolinguist. The fleet commander, designation translated roughly as primary arbiter of resource allocation, discussed humanity's response with what their species considered confusion. The brevity registered as either supreme arrogance or profound stupidity. Their cultural framework had no category for the possibility that fewer words meant a decision had already been made. "They think we're bluffing," Torres said from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach, but she'd grown familiar with his presence over 18 months of collaboration, the way her body registered his proximity before her conscious mind acknowledged it. Their experience validates that assumption. Sarah didn't turn from her displays. 47 successful resource extractions. Every species they've encountered negotiated eventually. Torres moved to stand beside her station, close enough that she could see his reflection in the curved holographic interface. He looked worse than she felt. Shadows under his eyes, jaw tight with the particular tension that came from holding a firing solution in your mind while hoping you wouldn't need to execute it. "How long before they move?" he asked. "Their protocols allow for a 72-hour analysis period. They'll spend that time studying our military capabilities, looking for leverage points." Sarah pulled up a timeline, highlighting the countdown in soft amber. "They're predictable. That's their weakness. And ours." She finally looked at him, found his eyes already on her. "We're not predictable enough. They can't model our decision trees because we don't follow standard escalation protocols." Torres's hand settled on the back of her chair, close enough that she felt the warmth of his palm through the material. Not touching, but present. "You should sleep," he said quietly. "I need you sharp when they make their move." "I'm sharp now." Sarah. The use of her first name registered like a physical touch. He rarely used it, preferring the professional distance of rank and title. "When's the last time you left this room?" She couldn't remember. Time had compressed into an endless present of monitoring, analyzing, waiting. "When's the last time you did?" she countered. His mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. "Fair point." His hand shifted on her chair, fingers very close to her shoulder, but not quite making contact. "There's a cot in my office. We could both use a few hours." The suggestion hung in the air between them, charged with implications neither of them was ready to name. Professional necessity braided with something else, something that lived in the space between words where 2 people who'd seen each other make terrible choices recognized a mirror. "Your office has better coffee," Sarah said, finally standing. The movement brought her close to him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, to notice the particular scent of fatigue and recycled air that marked everyone who'd been on high alert for too long. Torres didn't step back. For a moment they stood in that narrow space, the tactical center's ambient light casting shadows across his features, and Sarah felt her pulse accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with alien threats or strategic calculations. Then he moved aside, gesturing toward the door with careful courtesy, and the moment passed into the category of things they both noticed and neither acknowledged. His office was smaller than hers, more austere, dominated by a tactical display that currently showed the Harvest Fleet's formation in stark detail. A narrow cot occupied one wall, military standard, designed for functionality rather than comfort. He'd clearly been using it. A blanket lay half-folded at one end, and his jacket hung from a nearby hook. "I'll take the chair," Torres said, moving toward his desk. "Don't be ridiculous. You're running the defense coordination." Sarah sat on the cot, testing its firmness. "Wake me in 4 hours or when they move, whichever comes first." He hesitated, and in that pause, Sarah recognized the same careful consideration he brought to every tactical decision. The cot was narrow, barely wide enough for one person. The chair was designed for work, not rest. The mathematics of exhaustion versus strategic necessity played out across his features. "We could share," she said quietly, the suggestion emerging before she could examine its wisdom. "We're both adults, we both need sleep." Torres looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite pass: surprise, consideration, and something warmer that he carefully controlled. "You're sure?" Sarah lay down, turning to face the wall, making space. 4 hours, Admiral. Don't make me regret the offer." She felt the cot shift as he settled beside her, his body a line of warmth along her back. He didn't touch her, maintaining a careful inch of separation, but his presence registered with the same intensity as contact. His breathing slowed, deepened, and Sarah found her own rhythm synchronizing unconsciously. "Sarah," he said quietly into the darkness. "When they move us, it's going to be worse than anything we've modeled." She understood what he wasn't saying, that they'd helped architect something that would define how the galaxy perceived humanity for generations, that the weight of those choices would never fully leave them. "I know," she whispered. His hand found hers in the narrow space between them, fingers interlacing with a certainty that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Neither of them pulled away. They lay together in the darkness. Two people who'd built careers on maintaining distance and waited for the universe to test the boundaries they'd drawn. Sarah woke to find Torres gone, his absence marked by cooling sheets and the particular quality of silence that meant she was alone. The chronometer showed she'd slept for 3 hours and 47 minutes. Not enough, but more than she'd managed in the previous 3 days combined. She found him in the tactical center, standing before the primary display with the stillness that had become familiar over 18 months of service. The Harvest Fleet maintained its position, but something about the formation had changed. The ships had shifted into a tighter configuration, a geometric pattern that spoke of imminent action. "They're preparing to advance," Torres said without turning. He'd known she was there before she spoke, the same way she'd learned to sense his presence. "Another 6 hours, maybe less." Sarah moved to stand beside him, studying the alien formation with professional detachment, while her body remained acutely aware of his proximity. They'd shared a cot for less than 4 hours, a practical arrangement born of exhaustion and limited space, but something had shifted in that darkness. Some boundary had been acknowledged, if not crossed. "The civilian populations?" she asked. "Continuing normal routines, no evacuation orders, no mobilization announcements." Torres finally looked at her, and the weight in his eyes spoke of the calculations he'd been running while she slept. "We need them to see us as confident, not desperate, or completely ignorant of the threat." That too. His mouth quirked in something too grim to be called a smile. "The aliens can't decide which." Sarah pulled up the communication intercepts, listening to the Harvest Fleet's internal discussions with the focused intensity that had made her valuable to the Defense Corps. The fleet commander expressed frustration at humanity's lack of response to their presence. In their experience, species either negotiated immediately or showed obvious signs of military preparation. Humanity did neither, and the aliens had no framework for interpreting that particular silence. "They think we don't understand the threat," Sarah said quietly. "Their linguistic analysis assumes we're either technologically primitive or suffering from some kind of collective delusion." Torres moved closer, ostensibly to view her translation matrices, but the proximity felt deliberate. His shoulder aligned with hers, creating a point of contact that grounded her in her body after hours of existing purely in analytical abstraction. "What would you do?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "If you were them?" Sarah considered the question with the same precision she brought to linguistic analysis. I'd probe the defenses, send a small force to test response capabilities while maintaining the primary fleet in reserve. Standard doctrine for dealing with an unknown quantity. They won't do that. She turned to look at him, found his gaze already on her. Why not? Because they're not dealing with an unknown quantity. They think they know exactly what we are, another species that will negotiate once faced with overwhelming force. They've done this 47 times. Torres's hand rose as if to touch her face, then diverted to gesture at the display. Their confidence is their weakness. Sarah understood what he was telling her, that the battle plan had been built around the aliens' assumption of human predictability, that when the Harvest fleet advanced, expecting negotiation or token resistance, they would instead encounter something their protocols couldn't accommodate. "How many ships do we have in position?" she asked. "Enough." His hand settled on her lower back, a touch so brief it might have been accidental if not for the deliberateness in his eyes. "You should eat something. It's going to be a long day." The station's commissary operated on a minimal crew during high alert, serving food that optimized for nutrition rather than flavor. Sarah sat across from Torres at a corner table, the same spot they'd occupied dozens of times over 18 months, sharing meals that served as brief respites from the weight of their respective duties. He'd brought her coffee without asking. Black, no sugar, exactly as she preferred. The gesture spoke of attention paid over months of proximity, small details accumulated and remembered. "Tell me something that's not about the aliens," Torres said, wrapping his hands around his own cup. "Something real." Sarah studied him across the table, this man who made decisions that would end lives and carried the weight of those choices in the particular way he held his shoulders, the shadows that never quite left his eyes. "Why?" "Because in 6 hours we're going to watch something happen that we helped architect, and I need to remember why it matters." He met her gaze steadily. "I need to remember what we're defending." She could have deflected, maintained the professional distance they'd both cultivated so carefully. Instead, she found herself speaking. "I wanted to be a concert pianist, before linguistics, before all of this. I spent 10 years at the conservatory, practicing 8 hours a day, building calluses and muscle memory. What happened? I was good, very good, but not transcendent, and in that world very good isn't enough." Sarah wrapped her own hands around her coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into her perpetually cold fingers. "I needed something where being very good actually mattered, where precision and analysis could make a difference." Torres was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. "Do you miss it? The music?" "Every day." The admission emerged before she could examine its wisdom. "But I don't regret the choice. This matters more." His hand crossed the table, covering hers where it rested beside her cup. The contact was warm, solid, deliberate. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I'd like to hear you play." Sarah turned her hand beneath his, their palms meeting in a touch that felt both simple and profound. "I don't have access to a piano. I'll find one." The certainty in his voice made it sound like a promise, like a future that extended beyond the next 6 hours, beyond the inevitable confrontation with the Harvest fleet. They sat together in the quiet commissary, hands joined across the table, and didn't speak of what would come next. The silence between them had its own language now, one that required no translation. The Harvest fleet advanced at 1400 hours GMT, their formation perfect, their velocity calculated to demonstrate overwhelming force without appearing overtly aggressive. Standard doctrine, refined across 47 successful encounters with species who'd eventually learned to negotiate. Sarah watched from her station in the tactical center, her hands flat against the console edge to keep them from trembling. Torres stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the particular tension that came from knowing what would happen next and being unable to stop it. "All positions report ready," someone called from across the center. The voice sounded distant, filtered through the rushing in Sarah's ears as her body responded to the proximity of violence. Torres didn't move. Neither did she. To move would be to acknowledge what they were witnessing, what they had helped architect through careful planning, and the precise deployment of forces into positions the aliens couldn't detect. The human response began without transmission, without warning, without any of the graduated escalation protocols that the Harvest Fleet expected. Ships appeared from impossible positions, asteroid fields, debris clouds, gravitational shadows that had concealed them for months. Not just military vessels, but converted civilian craft, mining ships with improvised weapon systems, colony transports retrofitted for ramming speed. The attack pattern followed no recognizable doctrine because it wasn't military strategy. It was collective will expressing itself through coordinated violence. Every ship that could carry a weapon or serve as a projectile had been positioned, waiting for this moment. Sarah's breath caught as the engagement unfolded across multiple displays. The aliens' communication channels flooded with distress signals, requests for clarification, demands for negotiation protocols. Their formation fractured as individual ships broke away in survival trajectories, abandoning tactical cohesion for individual escape. Torres's hand settled on her shoulder, solid and warm, grounding her back into her body. She leaned back fractionally, accepting the support, feeling the wall of his presence against her spine. His other hand came to rest on her other shoulder, and she reached up without thinking, covering his hand with hers. Neither of them spoke. Around them, the tactical center operated with grim efficiency, coordinating the human forces as they drove the Harvest Fleet back beyond the boundary markers. The attack continued with mechanical precision until the alien ships crossed the threshold, then stopped immediately, human forces disappearing back into their concealed positions with the same eerie coordination that had marked their emergence. Silence returned, but it was different now, charged with the memory of what humans considered restraint. Sarah finally exhaled, a long, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Torres's hands tightened on her shoulders, thumbs pressing into the muscle there in a way that was both reassuring and intimate, a familiarity earned through crisis and proximity and the particular weight of shared choices. "They'll tell the others," Sarah said finally, her voice rough from disuse. "Every species in contact. That humans don't warn twice." Torres's hands slid from her shoulders, but one captured hers as it fell, fingers interlacing with a certainty that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She turned in her chair to face him, found his eyes already on her, dark and intent and carrying the same weight she felt in her chest. "Good," he said quietly. "Maybe the next fleet will listen." She stood, and they were close now, closer than professional necessity could justify, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the particular intensity that came into his expression when he looked at her. "And if they don't?" she asked. Torres didn't answer immediately. His free hand rose to her face, fingers tracing her jaw with a gentleness that contrasted starkly with the violence they'd just witnessed. "Then we show them again," he said, "until they understand that human mercy looks like a second chance. And there's never a third." Sarah closed her eyes against the touch, feeling something inside her chest crack open, some careful distance she'd maintained through 6 years of service, 18 months of proximity, 72 hours of waiting. When she opened them again, Torres was still there, still close, still looking at her as if she was something worth defending. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "How to be someone who helps orchestrate violence and also someone who—" He kissed her, cutting off the words she couldn't find, his mouth warm and certain against hers. Sarah's hands fisted in his uniform, pulling him closer, needing the solid reality of his body against hers after hours of existing in tactical abstractions. The tactical center continued its operations around them, personnel maintaining professional focus on their duties, and Sarah realized they were far from the first pair to seek human connection in the aftermath of coordinated violence, that this was simply how people survived the weight of necessary choices. When they finally pulled apart, Torres rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard. "We have 6 hours before the next shift," he said quietly. "Come with me." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered it anyway. "Yes." His quarters were austere, dominated by tactical displays and strategic briefings, but the bed was wider than the cot they'd shared, and when they fell into it together, the universe contracted to the space between their bodies, to skin and breath, and the particular language of touch that required no translation. Sarah woke to find morning, or what passed for morning on the station's arbitrary 26-hour cycle, had arrived without her notice. Torres lay beside her, one arm draped across her waist, his breathing deep and even in a way she'd never heard before. Always, in the tactical center or during brief rest periods, his sleep had been light, ready to snap to full alertness at any disturbance. This was different. This was trust. She didn't move, unwilling to break whatever spell had allowed him this peace. Light from the viewport cast shifting shadows across his features, and Sarah found herself cataloguing details she'd deliberately avoided noticing before. The scar along his left temple, the grey at his temples, the way his mouth softened in sleep. His eyes opened, found her already watching. Something passed between them, a moment of vulnerability that felt more intimate than the hours they'd spent tangled together in darkness. Then his hand moved on her hip, thumb tracing slow circles through the thin fabric of her borrowed shirt, and Sarah felt her breath catch. "We should talk," Torres said quietly. "Should we?" Sarah shifted closer, seeking the warmth of his body. "Or should we acknowledge that we're both adults who made a choice and see what happens next?" His hand slid up her spine, fingers tracing the ridge of her vertebrae with careful attention. "I'm your commanding officer. You're the station's commanding officer. I'm Civilian Corps." Sarah pressed her palm against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath her hand. "Different command structures. That's semantics. I deal in semantics professionally." She tilted her head to look at him properly. "If this is you offering me an exit, I'm declining." Torres was quiet for a long moment, his hand still moving in slow patterns across her back. "I wasn't offering an exit," he finally said. "I was making sure you knew the complications. I'm fluent in 43 languages. I think I can handle complicated." His mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. Then he rolled, pinning her beneath him with careful deliberateness, and Sarah found her breath shortening for entirely different reasons as his weight settled against her, solid and warm and present. "Good," he said quietly, his mouth very close to hers. "Because I have no intention of making this simple." The days after the Harvest Fleet's retreat developed their own rhythm. Sarah returned to her linguistic analysis, monitoring communication traffic across known species as news of humanity's response spread through established contact networks. The message was consistent. Humans had issued a single warning, then responded to boundary violation with overwhelming coordinated violence. No negotiation, no graduated response, just consequence. Torres resumed his command duties, coordinating defense preparations and running scenarios for future encounters. They maintained professional distance during duty hours, a courtesy to the crew and to their own reputations. But the nights belonged to them alone, stolen hours where they could shed the weight of their responsibilities and exist as simply Sarah and Marcus, two people learning each other's bodies and boundaries with the same careful attention they brought to their professional work. Sarah learned that Torres preferred coffee even worse than hers, drank it black and scalding while reviewing tactical reports in the pre-dawn hours. That he had a scar on his left shoulder from a training accident that had nearly ended his career. That he played chess in his head when he couldn't sleep, working through ancient games move by move. Torres learned that Sarah's hands were always cold, that she mumbled in Mandarin when dreaming, that she needed absolute silence to work through complex translations, but sought human contact afterward, craving the warmth of another body to ground her back in physical reality. 3 weeks after the Harvest Fleet's retreat, Torres found Sarah in her office, staring at a linguistic pattern she couldn't quite pass. He didn't speak, simply moved to stand behind her chair, hands settling on her shoulders with the casual familiarity of established intimacy. "Tell me what you're seeing," he said quietly. Sarah gestured at the display. "Communication traffic from the Velkari Trade Federation. They're discussing humanity in contexts that don't quite translate. The semantic markers suggest fear, but also respect. It's not a combination their language usually accommodates." His thumbs pressed into the tight muscles along her shoulders, working out tension with practiced efficiency. "That's good, isn't it?" "I don't know." Sarah leaned back into his touch, letting her eyes close. Fear and respect together can calcify into something dangerous. We need to be more than the species that responds to threats with overwhelming violence. We are more than that. Torres's hands stilled on her shoulders. The question is, How we demonstrate it without appearing weak. Sarah turned in her chair to look up at him. That's the problem, isn't it? We've defined ourselves by a single action. Everything after has to support that narrative or risk undermining it. He studied her face with the intensity she'd learned meant he was processing something important. What would you do? If you could architect the next phase of contact? I'd find ways to demonstrate human capacity for things other than violence. Art, music, philosophy. The cultural artifacts that make us worth preserving, not just worth fearing. She reached up, covering his hand where it rested on her shoulder. But that's not what they hired me for. No. Torres pulled her to her feet and she went willingly into his arms. They hired you to translate intent into words. But maybe it's time to expand the definition of intent. Sarah pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of him, recycled air and coffee and something essentially Marcus beneath it all. You're suggesting a cultural exchange program? I'm suggesting we let the galaxy see us as something other than a species that doesn't warn twice. His hand moved on her back, tracing patterns that felt both soothing and possessive. Starting small. Academic exchanges, artistic collaborations, the kind of soft power that builds over years. That would require approval from Earth Command. Then help me make the case. Torres pulled back enough to look at her, and the vulnerability in his expression made her chest ache. I'm good at tactics and strategy, Sarah, but you're the one who understands how cultures communicate beyond words. Show me how to build a bridge instead of just defending a boundary. Sarah kissed him, pouring into the contact everything she couldn't articulate, gratitude and desire and the terrifying recognition that somewhere between analyzing alien linguistics and sharing his bed, she'd fallen into something that felt uncomfortably close to love. The cultural exchange proposal took shape over weeks of collaboration, drafted in the hours between duty shifts and refined during quiet mornings in Torres's quarters. Sarah approached it with the same precision she brought to linguistic analysis, identifying potential partner species, matching human cultural assets with alien interests, building frameworks for exchange that minimized security risks while maximizing cultural exposure. Torres translated her vision into military doctrine, identifying ways the program could serve strategic objectives while maintaining its primary purpose as cultural bridge building. Together, they created something neither could have achieved alone, a comprehensive proposal that Earth Command approved with surprising speed. The first exchange brought a Velkari cultural historian to the station for a 6-week residency. Dr. Charvel arrived with the particular wariness of someone whose species had spent centuries navigating power dynamics through careful diplomacy. Sarah met her at the docking bay, prepared to serve as primary liaison and translator. The Velkari stood perhaps 4 feet tall, her chitinous exoskeleton decorated with bioluminescent patterns that shifted with her emotional state. Her primary eyes fixed on Sarah with intelligent curiosity, while her secondary eyes scanned the docking bay's architecture. Dr. Chen, Charvel said in carefully practiced standard, your reputation suggests precision in translation. I hope to learn whether reputation matches reality. Sarah smiled at the subtle challenge embedded in the greeting. I hope my reality exceeds your expectations, Dr. Charvel. Welcome to Kepler 7. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself spending long hours with the Velkari historian, explaining human cultural artifacts and answering questions that ranged from practical to deeply philosophical. Charvel was particularly fascinated by human music, a concept her species understood intellectually, but experienced differently through their vibration-sensitive exoskeletons. Your people create organized sound patterns for emotional resonance? Charvel's bioluminescent patterns flickered in what Sarah had learned, indicated confusion. This serves no survival function. It serves emotional and social functions, Sarah explained. Music helps us process feelings, build community, mark significant moments. Inefficient, but Charvel's patterns shifted toward curiosity. I wish to experience this inefficiency. Can you demonstrate? Sarah led the historian to a maintenance bay that doubled as impromptu recreation space, where someone had set up an old electronic keyboard against the far wall. She hadn't touched a piano in 6 years, had convinced herself that part of her life was finished. But her fingers remembered, settling into position with the muscle memory of 10,000 practice hours. She played Chopin, a nocturne she'd performed at her final recital, delicate and melancholic and achingly human. The notes filled the space, and Sarah found herself transported back to a different version of herself, one who'd believed precision and passion could exist in perfect harmony. When she finished, Chauvel's patterns had settled into a color Sarah had never seen before, deep indigo shot through with gold. "Extraordinary," the historian said quietly. "I understand now why humans defended their boundaries so absolutely. A species capable of creating such organized beauty is worth preserving." Sarah found Torres in his office that evening, reviewing security protocols for the exchange program. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression made him set aside his work immediately. "What happened?" he asked. She moved into his arms without speaking, needing the solid reality of his body to ground her after hours spent suspended in memory and music. Torres held her, one hand moving in slow patterns on her back, patient as she processed whatever had shaken her. "I played for Chauvel," Sarah finally said against his chest. "The piano in Recreation Bay 3, and I remembered why I used to love it. Why I gave it up." "Sarah." Torres pulled back enough to see her face, his hands framing her jaw with careful tenderness. "Why did you give it up?" "Because I wasn't transcendent. Because very good wasn't enough in that world." She closed her eyes against the ache in her chest. "But I've spent 6 years being very good at something that actually matters, Marcus. And I don't know if I can go back to caring about whether I'm transcendent at something that doesn't." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth, soft touches that felt like reassurance, like permission to be uncertain. "You don't have to decide now," he said quietly. "You don't have to choose between versions of yourself. Maybe you can be both." Sarah let herself believe it, at least for the moment. Let herself imagine a future where she could be the woman who translated alien linguistics and the woman who played Chopin nocturnes, where precision and passion weren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a whole person. That night in Torres's bed, she showed him what music felt like translated into touch, careful attention to rhythm and pressure, to the building crescendo of sensation, to the particular harmony of two bodies learning to move together with practiced precision. And afterward, wrapped in his arms with their heartbeats gradually slowing toward equilibrium, Sarah thought maybe Chauvel had been right. Maybe humans were worth preserving, inefficiencies and all. The cultural exchange program expanded over the following months, bringing artists and historians and philosophers from a dozen species to Kepler-7. Sarah found herself serving as primary liaison for most of them, her linguistic expertise and cultural sensitivity making her the natural bridge between human and alien perspectives. She loved the work in a way that surprised her, the daily challenge of translation not just between languages, but between fundamentally different ways of perceiving reality. Each species brought their own frameworks for understanding music, art, philosophy, and Sarah learned to navigate between them with increasing fluency. But the work accumulated its own weight, late nights reviewing cultural protocols, early mornings mediating misunderstandings between species with incompatible social frameworks, the constant low-level stress of being responsible for preventing interspecies incidents while fostering genuine connection. Torres noticed before she did. He'd developed the habit of appearing in her office during the hours she was most likely to forget basic self-care, bringing coffee or food, or simply his presence as a reminder that she existed outside her work. "You need a break," he said one evening, finding her hunched over translation matrices at 0200 hours. "When's the last time you left the station?" Sarah couldn't remember. The cultural exchange program had consumed her life, become the organizing principle around which everything else orbited. "I can't." The Hrental delegation arrives in 48 hours, and their cultural protocols are completely incompatible with standard station operations. "Then we have 48 hours to fix that." Torres closed her displays with administrative override, ignoring her protest. "Pack for 3 days, we're taking the shuttle to Europa Station." "Marcus, I can't just—" "You can. I've already cleared it with Earth Command." He pulled her to her feet, hands firm on her shoulders. "Sarah, you're burning out. I can see it. And if you collapse, the entire program suffers." She wanted to argue, but the exhaustion hit her all at once. 6 months of mediating between species, of translating not just words, but entire conceptual frameworks, of being the human face of Earth's attempt to be something more than the species that didn't warn twice. Her body sagged against his, and Torres caught her weight easily. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." 3 days. Europa Station served primarily as a research facility, studying the ice moon's subsurface ocean for signs of life. It was smaller than Kepler-7, more intimate, with observation domes that offered stunning views of Jupiter's banded atmosphere. Torres had reserved a suite with transparent walls on 3 sides, creating the illusion of floating in space. Sarah stood at the viewport, watching Jupiter's great red spot rotate slowly into view, and felt something inside her chest finally unclench. Behind her, Torres moved through the space with quiet efficiency, setting their bags aside, adjusting the environmental controls. "Come here," he said quietly. She went to him, let him pull her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her from behind as they stood together, watching Jupiter's ancient storms rage across a canvas larger than Earth. His chin rested on top of her head, and Sarah felt her breathing slow to match his, the tension gradually leaving her shoulders. "I'm proud of you," Torres said quietly. "What you've built with the exchange program. It's changing how the galaxy sees us. Sees humanity as something worth knowing, not just worth fearing." "I don't feel proud." Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "I feel exhausted and overwhelmed, and like I'm constantly one mistake away from causing an interspecies incident." His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with careful tenderness. "That's because you care, because you're carrying the weight of trying to get it right." He kissed her forehead, her nose, her mouth. "But you don't have to carry it alone. Let me help." Sarah kissed him back, pouring into it all the exhaustion and frustration and desperate need for human connection that she'd been suppressing for months. Torres responded with matching intensity, his hands sliding into her hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss. They made it to the bed this time, barely, shedding clothes with fumbling urgency. And when Torres moved inside her, Sarah felt tears slip from the corners of her eyes, not from pain or sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being fully present in her body, fully connected to another human being, after months of existing primarily in her mind. "I've got you," Torres murmured against her throat. "I've got you, Sarah." And she believed him. The 3 days on Europa Station passed in a haze of rest and reconnection. They slept late, ate meals without checking chronometers, made love with the slow deliberation of people who had time to spare. Torres taught her a card game he'd learned during his early service years. Sarah played piano pieces on the suite's small keyboard, rediscovering the pleasure of music, made for its own sake rather than as cultural demonstration. On their last evening, they lay together in the darkened suite, Jupiter filling half the sky beyond the viewport. Torres's fingers traced idle patterns on her bare shoulder, and Sarah found herself speaking thoughts she'd been afraid to examine too closely. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said quietly, "and it terrifies me." His hand stilled on her shoulder. "Why terrifying?" "Because I've spent my entire adult life maintaining control over my work, my emotions, my choices. And this, it feels like losing control, like wanting something I can't translate into precise language." Torres was quiet for a long moment. Then he rolled, positioning himself above her, his weight settling between her thighs with familiar comfort. "Good," he said, his voice rough. "Because I fell in love with you months ago and I've been terrified you'd figure it out and run." Sarah's breath caught. "Marcus?" He kissed her, slow and deep and thorough, his body moving against hers with the practiced rhythm they'd developed over months of learning each other. And Sarah let go of control, let herself fall into the sensation and emotion and terrifying vulnerability of loving someone who could hurt her, simply by existing in her life and then leaving it. When they returned to Kepler-7, something had shifted. They were still professional during duty hours, still maintained the careful boundaries that protected both their reputations and the integrity of their work. But the nights belonged to them completely now, acknowledged territory, where they could be simply Marcus and Sarah, two people who'd found something worth keeping in the aftermath of coordinated violence. The Hrental delegation arrived with 17 cultural attachés and a set of protocols so complex that Sarah spent 3 days mediating between their requirements and station operational reality. The Hrental were obsessively hierarchical, every interaction governed by elaborate rituals of status acknowledgement. They found human informality disturbing, interpreted casual interactions as deliberate insults. Sarah navigated the tension with practiced diplomacy, translating not just their words, but the entire conceptual framework that made those words meaningful. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the fact that the Hrental seemed actively resistant to finding common ground. "They're testing us," Torres said after she'd spent 12 hours mediating a dispute over seating arrangements at a diplomatic dinner. "Seeing if we'll compromise our cultural practices to accommodate theirs." Sarah pressed her fingers against her temples, feeling the beginning of a migraine. "I know, but if we don't find some way to bridge the gap, the entire exchange collapses. And that sends a message to other species that humans are only interested in cultural exchange on our terms." "Sarah." Torres pulled her hands away from her face, holding them in his. "You can't sacrifice yourself to make this work. Sometimes cultural gaps are too wide to bridge. I have to try." She pulled away from him, exhaustion making her voice sharp. "This program is the only thing standing between humanity and being known solely as the species that responds to threats with overwhelming violence. If it fails, it fails, and we try something else." Torres's voice carried the particular firmness that meant he'd made a command decision. "I'm pulling you from the Hrental liaison role. Doctor, Martinez can take over." "No." Sarah felt panic rise in her chest. "Marcus, you can't. I'm the only one who's fluent in their status protocol frameworks. And you're also the woman I love, who's been working 20-hour days for 6 months straight." He moved to stand in front of her, hands settling on her shoulders with gentle insistence. "I'm not asking, Sarah. I'm telling you as the station's commanding officer that you're being reassigned to a less intensive role for the next 2 weeks." She wanted to argue, but the exhaustion crashed over her all at once. 6 months of translating between incompatible worldviews. 6 months of being the bridge between humanity and the galaxy. 6 months of carrying the weight of trying to demonstrate that humans were worth knowing, not just worth fearing. "I don't know how to not be essential," she whispered. Torres pulled her against his chest and Sarah let herself collapse into his strength. "You are essential," he said quietly. "Just not in the way you think, not to the program. To me, to the life we're trying to build together." The words hit something deep in Sarah's chest, cracking open a truth she'd been avoiding. That she'd built her entire adult life around being essential to her work, around being the person who could do things others couldn't. And the thought of not being essential, of being replaceable, terrified her more than any alien threat. "I don't know who I am if I'm not the best at something," she said against his chest. "Then maybe it's time to find out." Torres's hand moved on her back, familiar and grounding. "And I'll be here while you figure it out. Doctor." Martinez took over the Hrental liaison role with competent efficiency. Sarah watched from the sidelines, feeling simultaneously relieved and bereft. She'd been reassigned to archival work, cataloguing and analyzing the cultural exchange data accumulated over 6 months. Important work, but not urgent, not essential. She hated it. For the first week, Sarah threw herself into the archival analysis with the same intensity she'd brought to active liaison work. She reviewed every interaction, every translation, looking for patterns and insights that might improve future exchanges. Torres found her in the archives at 0100 hours, surrounded by data displays, her eyes red from staring at screens for too long. "This is what getting reassigned to less intensive work looks like," he asked dryly. Sarah didn't look at him. "I'm just finishing the cultural protocol analysis. Sarah." He moved to stand beside her, one hand settling on her shoulder. "You're doing it again, trying to be essential." "I don't know how not to." She finally looked at him, and the vulnerability in her expression made his chest ache. "I've spent my entire adult life building my identity around being exceptionally competent at difficult things. If I'm not that, what am I?" Torres pulled her to her feet, framing her face in his hands. "You're the woman I love, the woman who plays Chopin when she thinks no one's listening, the woman who mumbles in Mandarin when she dreams, the woman who's terrified of not being essential, but who's essential to me just by existing." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks. "That's not enough. I know you don't believe that yet." Torres kissed her forehead, her cheeks tasting salt. "But I'm going to keep telling you until you do. You are enough, Sarah, just as you are. Not for what you can do or translate or mediate. Just for being you. They stood together in the dim archives, Sarah crying against his chest while he held her, and something inside her began to shift. Some careful architecture she'd built around the idea that her value derived from her competence, her essentialness, her ability to do what others couldn't. Maybe, she let herself think, maybe she could learn to be someone who mattered simply by existing, simply by being loved and loving in return. It was terrifying. But standing in Torres's arms, feeling the solid reality of his presence, Sarah thought maybe it was a kind of terror worth facing. Sarah tried to follow Torres's directive. She worked reasonable hours on archival analysis. She attended the diplomatic dinners as an observer rather than primary liaison. She even started playing piano again, setting aside time each evening to work through pieces she'd abandoned years ago. But the restlessness wouldn't leave. Every day she watched Dr. Martinez manage the cultural exchanges with competent efficiency, and every day Sarah felt more adrift, more uncertain about who she was when she wasn't essential. 3 weeks after being reassigned, the Meridian delegation arrived. They were philosophers from a species that communicated primarily through complex mathematical proofs, finding human language imprecise and emotionally unreliable. Dr. Martinez struggled with the translation, the conceptual gap between mathematical precision and linguistic meaning, proving too wide to bridge effectively. Sarah watched from the observation deck as a diplomatic dinner deteriorated into mutual incomprehension. The Meridian grew frustrated with what they perceived as human, intellectual laziness. The human delegates took offense at what seemed like condescension. Dr. Martinez tried to mediate, but her translations lacked the nuanced understanding of both mathematical and emotional frameworks necessary to find common ground. "I could fix this," Sarah said quietly, knowing Torres stood behind her even before he spoke. "I know," he said. "But should you?" She turned to face him, feeling the familiar pull of being needed, warring with the terrifying question of whether she could let herself not be essential. They're going to fail without proper translation. The entire exchange will collapse and the Meridian will leave thinking humans are intellectually inferior. And if that happens, we try again, with different species, different frameworks. Torres moved closer, his hands settling on her shoulders. "Sarah, you can't save every exchange. You can't be the bridge between every incompatible worldview. But I could save this one." She heard the desperation in her voice, hated it. "I understand both the mathematical precision they need and the emotional resonance humans require. I could translate between them." "At what cost?" Torres's hands tightened on her shoulders. "You spent 6 months running yourself into exhaustion, trying to be essential to everyone. And now 3 weeks after being reassigned, you're ready to jump back into that pattern because you can't stand not being needed." The words hit like a physical blow, exposing the truth Sarah had been avoiding. That she was addicted to being essential, to being the person who could do what others couldn't. That the thought of not being needed felt like erasure, like ceasing to exist in any meaningful way. "I don't know how to matter if I'm not essential," she whispered. Torres pulled her against his chest, and Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You matter to me," he said quietly. "Not because of what you can translate or mediate or fix, because you're you, because I love you. But I can't compete with your need to be essential to everyone else, Sarah, and I'm not going to try." The words settled between them like a boundary line, clear and impassable. Sarah understood what he was telling her, that she had to choose between her addiction to being essential and the relationship they were building, that he wouldn't stay and watch her destroy herself, trying to save every cultural exchange. "I need time," she said against his chest. "To think. Take it." Torres kissed the top of her head, and Sarah felt the loss already beginning. "But understand that I can't keep watching you prioritize being essential over being whole. I love you too much to enable that." He left, and Sarah stood alone in the observation deck, watching the diplomatic dinner continue its deterioration into mutual incomprehension. She could fix it. She knew she could. One conversation with the Meridian delegation, translating their mathematical proofs into human emotional frameworks, and the exchange would succeed. But the cost would be proving Torres right. That she couldn't let herself not be essential, even when it meant losing something that mattered more than any cultural exchange. Sarah watched until the dinner ended, The meridian leaving with what their bioluminescent patterns indicated was disappointment, the human delegates frustrated and defensive. Dr. Martinez looked exhausted and defeated, knowing she'd failed to bridge the conceptual gap. And Sarah did nothing. She returned to her quarters alone that night, the first time in weeks she hadn't shared Torres's bed. The space felt too large, too quiet, too full of the absence where his presence should have been. She lay in the darkness, feeling the weight of her choice settling in her chest. She could be essential, or she could be whole, but the person she'd been for 6 years, brilliant, competent, essential to everyone, and close to no one, couldn't be the person who deserved Torres's love. Sarah didn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, feeling the architecture of her identity crack and shift, and began the terrifying work of imagining who she might become if she let herself not be essential. Sarah didn't return to active liaison work. She continued her archival analysis, attended diplomatic events as an observer, and let Dr. Martinez handle the day-to-day mediation. It felt like dying, like watching a part of herself cease to exist. Torres gave her space, though she saw him watching from across the tactical center, the dining hall, the observation decks. Waiting, she realized. Waiting to see if she could choose being whole over being essential. The Meridian delegation left after 2 weeks, their exchange marked as incomplete in the official records. Sarah read Dr. Martinez's final report, noting all the places where better translation could have bridged the gap, and forced herself not to offer corrections. This was the cost of choosing differently. This was what it meant to not be essential. She hated it. 2 weeks after the Meridian departure, Sarah found herself in the recreation bay at 0200 hours, unable to sleep, unable to stop her mind from cataloguing all the ways the cultural exchange program was suffering without her active involvement. She sat at the old keyboard, but her hands wouldn't find the keys. Music required presence, and she felt absent from her own life. "You look terrible," Torres said from the doorway. Sarah didn't turn. "I feel terrible." He moved to sit beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders touched, but not making any move to pull her into his arms. "Tell me what you're thinking." "That I don't know who I am if I'm not essential." The admission emerged raw, unfiltered. "That I've spent 6 years building an identity around being the person who can translate the untranslatable, bridge the unbridgeable. And without that I'm just ordinary." "You're not ordinary," Torres said quietly. "You're just not essential to everyone anymore. There's a difference." Sarah finally looked at him, found his eyes already on her, patient and steady. "I don't know how to do this, Marcus. How to let myself matter in smaller ways to fewer people. Start with one person." He reached for her hand, interlacing their fingers. "Matter to me. Not as the brilliant linguist or the cultural liaison. Just as Sarah." She wanted to argue that being Sarah wasn't enough, that she needed to be exceptional to deserve love. But the words caught in her throat, confronting the fundamental belief that had shaped her adult life, that she had to earn her worth through competence and achievement. "What if just being me isn't enough?" she whispered. Torres turned on the bench to face her fully, his free hand coming up to frame her jaw. "What if it is? What if you being ordinary, playing piano, mumbling in your sleep, getting my terrible jokes? What if that's not just enough, but exactly what I want?" Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, some careful defense she'd maintained against the possibility of being loved for simply existing. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Torres pulled her against him, holding her while she cried out months of exhaustion and fear, and the desperate need to be essential. "I'm so tired," she said against his chest, "of trying to be exceptional, of carrying the weight of everyone's incompatible worldviews." "Then put it down." His hand moved on her back, familiar and grounding. "Let someone else carry it for a while. Let yourself just be Sarah, who I love more than any exceptional linguist or cultural bridge." She kissed him, tasting salt and desperation and the terrifying freedom of letting herself be ordinary. Torres responded with matching intensity, his hands sliding into her hair, his body pressing against hers with familiar hunger. "Come home with me," he said against her mouth. "Let me show you what being essential to one person looks like." Sarah went. Let him lead her back to his quarters. Let him undress her with careful reverence. And when he moved inside her, she kept her eyes open, watching his face, seeing herself reflected in his gaze as something worth cherishing, not for what she could do, but simply for being herself. Afterward, wrapped in his arms with their heartbeats slowing toward equilibrium, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. The desperate need to be essential to everyone began to loosen its grip, replaced by the quieter certainty of mattering deeply to one person. "I want to try," she said quietly, "to be the person who can let herself not be essential to everyone, but I don't know if I can do it." "You don't have to do it perfectly," Torres kissed her forehead. "You just have to keep choosing it, every day, choosing to be whole over being essential." Sarah nodded against his chest, feeling the terror and possibility of that choice settling in her bones. It wouldn't be easy. Her entire identity had been built around being exceptional, being essential, being the person who could do what others couldn't. Learning to find value in being ordinary, in mattering deeply to a few rather than being necessary to many, would require rewriting fundamental assumptions about her own worth. But lying in Torres's arms, feeling the solid reality of his love for the ordinary version of herself, Sarah thought maybe it was work worth doing. 4 months after being reassigned from active liaison work, Sarah had settled into a new rhythm. She continued archival analysis, compiled recommendations for future cultural exchanges, and served as a consultant when Dr. Martinez needed specialized translation support. It was good work, important work, but not urgent, not essential. She hated it, less than she used to. Torres had been patient, watching her learn to find value in being ordinary, supporting her through the inevitable moments when she wanted to take back active liaison duties to prove she was still exceptional. He'd been firm, too, drawing clear boundaries when she tried to make herself essential to his work, to anyone's work, instead of choosing to be whole. They'd grown closer through that process, finding intimacy in the ordinary routines of shared life. Coffee in the mornings, strategy discussions that didn't require her brilliance, just her perspective. Evenings spent playing piano while he worked through administrative duties. Nights learning each other's bodies with the slow attention of people who had time to spare. Sarah was learning to be happy in ways that didn't require being essential. Then the harvest fleet returned. The alert came at 0400 hours, pulling Sarah from sleep in Torres's quarters. He was already moving, pulling on his uniform with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd trained for crisis his entire adult life. "Stay here," he said, pausing to kiss her forehead. "This isn't your crisis to manage." But it was. Sarah felt it in her bones as she watched the tactical displays from Torres's personal console. The harvest fleet held position beyond Mars orbit. Not 78 ships this time, but over 200. Her coalition force, representing multiple species who'd heard the stories of humanity's response, but needed to verify whether the warning was actually absolute. They transmitted a demand protocol, more carefully worded than the previous attempt, but fundamentally the same. Resource extraction rights presented as trade opportunity, structured to assume eventual compliance. Sarah read the linguistic patterns, the cultural assumptions embedded in word choice and grammatical structure, and understood immediately what they were testing. Whether humanity's warning had been genuine or merely reactive, whether the boundary would hold under increased pressure. She found Torres in the tactical center, coordinating defense preparations with grim efficiency. The station operated at maximum alert, every available personnel at their stations, running scenarios for an engagement that would dwarf the first encounter. "They brought friends," Torres said without looking away from his displays. 216 ships representing at least 8 species. All of them want to see if we really don't warn twice. Sarah moved to stand beside him, studying the alien formation with professional detachment. "What's our force disposition?" "Not enough." Torres finally looked at her, and the weight in his eyes made her chest ache. "We can hurt them badly. Maybe badly enough that they retreat. But we'll lose ships, people. This isn't going to be a clean demonstration of boundaries like last time." "Then negotiate." The words emerged before Sarah fully processed them, instinct overriding her carefully cultivated practice of not being essential. "Let me draft a response that offers them an alternative to testing our boundaries." Torres's jaw tightened. "Sarah, I know." She cut him off, understanding what he wasn't saying, that she was falling back into old patterns, making herself essential instead of trusting others to handle the crisis. But Marcus, this is literally my area of expertise. Translation, cultural frameworks, finding common ground between incompatible worldviews. I'm not trying to be essential to everyone. I'm offering to do the work I'm actually trained for. He studied her face with the intensity that meant he was processing multiple variables simultaneously. If I say yes, I need you to promise me something. What? That after this is over, you'll let it go. Win or lose, success or failure, you'll go back to being the Sarah who matters deeply to one person instead of being essential to everyone. His hand found hers, fingers interlacing. Because I can't lose you to the need to be essential, Sarah, not even to save lives. The condition hung between them, clear and non-negotiable. Sarah understood what he was offering, permission to be exceptional this one time, with the absolute requirement that she choose being whole afterward, that she not let crisis pull her back into the pattern of building her identity around being essential. I promise, she said quietly. After this, I'm done being the bridge between everyone's incompatible worldviews. But right now, let me try to prevent a war. Torres nodded slowly, then pulled her against him for a brief, fierce embrace. 4 hours, he said against her hair. That's how long before they expect a response. Make it count. Sarah returned to her office, pulled up the alien transmission, and began the work she'd trained 6 years to do. She analyzed the linguistic patterns, the cultural assumptions, the unspoken expectations embedded in their demand protocol, and she crafted a response that acknowledged their need for resources while offering an alternative to boundary testing. Not negotiation, which would signal weakness, not defiance, which would guarantee violence. Something else, a demonstration of human capacity for both strength and flexibility, for defending boundaries while acknowledging legitimate needs. She worked with the focused intensity that had made her exceptional, but this time she felt the difference. This wasn't about being essential. This was simply using her skills to try to prevent unnecessary death, to offer one more chance before violence became inevitable. When she finished, she sent the draft to Torres without explanation. Let him decide whether it was good enough, whether it served strategic objectives. Her part was done. He found her an hour later, still sitting at her desk, staring at nothing. It's brilliant, he said quietly. Earth Command approved it. We're transmitting now. Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar exhaustion that came after intense analytical work. And if they don't accept it? Then we fight. Torres pulled her to her feet, into his arms. And afterward, you keep your promise. You let this go and choose being whole over being essential. She kissed him, pouring into it everything she couldn't articulate, love and fear, and the desperate hope that her translation would be enough to prevent the violence she'd helped architect months ago from becoming a pattern that defined humanity's relationship with the galaxy. I will, she whispered against his mouth. I promise. The Harvest Fleet Coalition held position for 36 hours after receiving Sarah's response, long enough that she started to believe it might actually work, that her translation had offered them a way to save face while accepting humanity's boundary. Then they advanced, not in the aggressive formation that had marked their first attempt, but in a pattern that spoke of testing, of probing defenses while maintaining the option to retreat if resistance proved genuine. They were still looking for the point where humanity would negotiate instead of enforce boundaries. Sarah watched from the tactical center, standing beside Torres as he coordinated the human response. She'd kept her promise. The translation was her only contribution to crisis management. Now she was simply here as support, as the woman who loved him, watching him make choices that would end lives. All positions confirm ready, someone reported across the tactical center. Awaiting your order, Admiral. Torres stood absolutely still, his hand finding Sarah's beneath the console edge, fingers interlacing with hers. She felt the tension radiating through his body, the weight of the decision he was about to make. Execute defensive pattern Delta, he said quietly. Engage on my mark. The human ships emerged from their concealed positions, but this time the formation was different. They didn't attack. They intercepted, positioning themselves between the advancing coalition fleet and human territory, blocking forward progress without initiating violence. A warning made physical, a boundary demonstrated through presence rather than weapons fire. The coalition fleet slowed, their formation fragmenting as individual commanders made independent decisions about whether to press forward or retreat. Their communication channels flooded with debate, argument, the dissolution of unified purpose into individual survival calculation. Sarah listened to the alien conversations, translating in real time for Torres. The coalition was fracturing, some species ready to retreat, while others insisted humanity was still bluffing, that they would negotiate if sufficient pressure was applied. "They're not unified," she said quietly. "Some of them want to accept the alternative I proposed. But the original Harvest Fleet commanders are pushing for a test of force." Torres nodded, his hand tightening on hers. "Can you identify which ships are ready to retreat?" Sarah scanned the communication patterns, matching linguistic markers to ship identifications. "Marking them now." She highlighted 17 ships on the tactical display, vessels from species that had joined the coalition reluctantly, seeking resources but not committed to violence if alternatives existed. "Open a direct channel to those 17, Torres ordered. "Dr. Chen's translation transmitted on my authority." Sarah drafted the message with the same precision she'd brought to the initial response, offering the 17 ships immediate access to the alternative resource arrangement she'd proposed. Let them retreat with dignity, with resources secured, without having to test whether humanity's boundary was absolute. 12 of the 17 ships peeled away from the coalition formation within minutes, accepting the offer and withdrawing to designated coordinates. The remaining coalition forces watched their allies retreat, and Sarah could read the doubt spreading through their communication channels. Humanity had demonstrated both boundary enforcement and flexibility, both strength and alternatives. "The primary Harvest Fleet is ordering the coalition to advance," Sarah reported, tracking the alien commanders' increasingly desperate attempts to maintain unified purpose. "But most of the other species are breaking off." And they were. Ship by ship, the coalition fractured, individual commanders choosing retreat and alternative arrangements over testing humanity's boundary. Within 2 hours, only the original Harvest Fleet remained, 78 ships holding position while the rest of their coalition dispersed. "Final warning," Torres said quietly. "Sarah." She drafted it with 7 words, the same length as humanity's original message, but with different content. Words that acknowledged the Harvest Fleet's legitimate needs while making absolutely clear that boundary testing would not be tolerated. "Accept alternatives offered or face previous consequence." Torres read it once, nodded approval. "Transmit." The message reached the Harvest Fleet, and Sarah watched their commander process the options. Accept the offered alternatives and lose face among their own species, or advance and face certain defeat with no coalition support. They retreated, slowly, maintaining formation discipline, but retreating nonetheless. And as they crossed back beyond the boundary markers, Sarah felt something shift in her chest. They defended the boundary without massive violence. They demonstrated that humanity could offer alternatives while maintaining absolute clarity about consequences. "It worked," she said quietly, feeling Torres's hand tighten on hers. "You worked." He pulled her against him, and Sarah let herself collapse into his strength, feeling the exhaustion and relief crash over her simultaneously. "Your translation gave them a way to save face while accepting our terms." Sarah pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of him, fatigue and recycled air, and something essentially Marcus. "I kept my promise," she said. "This was my last crisis. After this, I'm just Sarah." "Good." Torres tilted her face up, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Because just Sarah is exactly who I want." He kissed her, and around them the tactical center erupted in quiet acknowledgement. Not celebration, but the grim satisfaction of people who defended a boundary without catastrophic cost. Sarah kissed him back, pouring into it everything she'd learned over 4 months of choosing to be whole instead of essential. That her value didn't derive from being exceptional or necessary, that mattering deeply to one person was enough. That being just Sarah was actually exactly who she wanted to be. 6 weeks after the coalition fleet's retreat, Sarah submitted her formal resignation from active cultural liaison duties. She would continue archival work, serve as consultant when specifically requested, but she was done being the primary bridge between humanity and alien worldviews. Earth Command accepted with surprising grace, perhaps recognizing that Dr. Chen's value had always been in her exceptional moments, rather than her sustained presence. Dr. Martinez took over as senior cultural liaison with Sarah's full endorsement and support. It felt like relief. Torres found her in the archives one evening, surrounded by data but actually playing solitaire on her tablet. She looked up when he entered, smiled in a way that made his chest ache with how much lighter she seemed than 6 months ago. "Productive day?" he asked dryly, nodding at the card game. "Very." Sarah closed the tablet without embarrassment. "I catalogued 3 cultural protocols, consulted on 1 translation issue, and spent 2 hours playing cards. I'm becoming magnificently ordinary." He pulled her to her feet, into his arms, feeling the easy way she molded against him now. 6 months ago, she would have been tense, still cataloguing all the work she wasn't doing, all the ways she wasn't being essential. Now she simply leaned into his warmth, present and relaxed. "I have a question," Torres said against her hair. "Marry me." Sarah pulled back, eyes wide. "What?" "Marry me." Torres framed her face in his hands, looking at her with the intensity that meant he'd already made the decision and was simply letting her catch up. "I love you, not the exceptional linguist or the cultural bridge, just you, the woman who plays Chopin when she thinks no one's listening, who mumbles in Mandarin when she dreams, who's learning to be magnificently ordinary." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "Marcus, I know it's fast by some standards, but we've served together for 2 years, loved each other for almost 1. I know who you are in crisis and in peace, exceptional and ordinary." His thumbs brushed away her tears with careful tenderness. "And I want to spend my life with all of those versions of you." Sarah kissed him instead of answering, pouring into it everything she felt, love and terror and gratitude, and the desperate joy of being chosen not for what she could do, but simply for being herself. "Yes," she said against his mouth. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony on Europa Station, the same suite where Torres had convinced Sarah to take her first real break. The guest list was small, close friends from the station, Dr. Martinez representing the cultural exchange program, a handful of family members who made the journey from Earth. Sarah wore a simple dress, nothing elaborate or designed to impress. Torres wore his dress uniform, looking at her like she was something worth treasuring. They spoke their vows against the backdrop of Jupiter's great red spot, promising to choose each other, not just in crisis, but in the ordinary accumulation of days that made a life. When Torres kissed her as his wife, Sarah felt something settle in her chest, a certainty she'd never found in being exceptional or essential, the quiet knowledge that she was enough, exactly as she was, for the person who mattered most. They honeymooned on Earth, 3 weeks away from the station and all its responsibilities. Sarah played piano in small venues, rediscovering the joy of music made for its own sake. Torres taught her to sail on Lake Michigan, laughing when she proved spectacularly untalented at it, loving her anyway. They were ordinary together, and it was enough. When they returned to Kepler-7, Sarah moved into Torres's quarters permanently. She continued her archival work, consulted occasionally on complex translations, and carved out time each evening to play piano in the recreation bay. Torres coordinated station defenses and cultural exchange security, trusted Sarah's judgment when she offered it, and loved her without needing her to be essential. They built a life together in the small moments. Coffee in the mornings, strategy discussions over dinner, nights learning each other's bodies with the comfortable familiarity of established intimacy. Sarah learned that being magnificently ordinary with the right person was actually the most exceptional thing she'd ever done. 2 years after the coalition fleet's retreat, Sarah stood in the observation deck of Kepler-7, watching a new cultural delegation arrive. The Threnal were musicians from a species that communicated primarily through harmonic resonance, and Sarah had been specifically requested to serve as consultant for their exchange. She'd said yes, but with clear boundaries. 2 weeks of translation support, then back to her ordinary life. Dr. Martinez would handle the ongoing liaison work. Sarah was simply offering her expertise in a limited capacity, not making herself essential. Targis joined her at the viewport, his hand settling on her lower back with familiar possessiveness. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "No." Sarah leaned into his touch. "Just remembering who I used to be. The woman who would have thrown herself into this completely, made herself indispensable, burned out trying to be everything to everyone. "And who are you now?" Sarah turned to face him, finding his eyes already on her, warm and steady. "I'm your wife. I'm a consultant who helps when asked and lets go when the work is done. I'm someone who plays piano for joy, not perfection. I'm learning to be whole instead of essential." Torres kissed her, soft and thorough. "I'm proud of you," he said against her mouth, "for choosing this, for choosing us. It's the best choice I've ever made." Sarah kissed him back, feeling the truth of those words settle in her bones. She spent 2 weeks working with the Threnal delegation, translating their harmonic communication into human linguistic frameworks. It was fascinating work, challenging in exactly the ways she'd always loved. But when the 2 weeks ended, Sarah handed the ongoing liaison duties to Dr. Martinez without regret. She had a piano recital to prepare for, a small concert featuring human classical music, offered as cultural exchange, but performed for her own joy as much as alien education. Torres would be in the audience, watching her with the particular intensity that meant he was seeing all the versions of her simultaneously, exceptional and ordinary, essential and whole. The night of the recital, Sarah stood backstage in the station's small performance venue, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that preceded any public performance. But it was different now. She wasn't playing to prove her transcendence or justify her value. She was simply sharing something beautiful because it brought her joy. Torres found her in the wings, pulled her against him for a brief, grounding embrace. "You're going to be magnificent," he whispered against her hair. "I'm going to be very good," Sarah corrected. "And that's enough." She played Chopin, Debussy, pieces she'd loved as a conservatory student and rediscovered as an adult, learning to find value in things done for their own sake. The audience, human and alien alike, listened with rapt attention, and Sarah felt the particular satisfaction of sharing something meaningful without needing to be essential to their experience. When she finished, Torres was waiting in the wings, pulling her into his arms with fierce pride. "Transcendent," he said against her mouth. Sarah laughed, kissing him back. "Very good. Exceptionally ordinary. Magnificently whole." They stood together in the dim backstage area, and Sarah felt the fullness of her life settle around her. Not perfect, not exceptional in every moment, but deeply, fundamentally enough. She had work that mattered without consuming her, a husband who loved her for simply existing, music that brought joy without requiring perfection, a life built not on being essential, but on being present. She'd spent 6 years translating between incompatible worldviews, learning to bridge impossible gaps through precision and expertise. But the most important translation she'd ever accomplished was learning the language of her own worth, understanding that she didn't need to be essential to everyone to matter deeply to herself. "Take me home," she said quietly. Torres kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. "You are home," he said. "Right here, with me." And he was right. Home wasn't a place or a position or a demonstration of essential competence. Home was the space between them, built from ordinary moments and extraordinary love, where Sarah could finally be exactly who she was, whole, present, and magnificently enough.